So today is cool because you get to hear from my pastor. Because I am blessed to have somebody who lives at home with me, who every single day is speaking words of encouragement to me and is helping me become a better follower of Jesus, and that's my wife. God bless me with a wife who isn't normally up here very often. She's actually a lot quieter than I am. I'm the crazy, insane, loud one, and she's the quiet one. But then when she speaks something to me, I'm like, wow, that's good. That's good. Those still waters run deep. And I was like, I should have thought of that. So as we got to the end of this year, we were talking about different stuff, and Amy brought up something that I think is terrific. So I wanted her just to speak it to you. Instead of me trying to communicate it and trying to be the intermediary of hearing what God was speaking, I was like, you should just do it. And amazingly, she said yes, even though this woman, she literally just gave birth to her third child, like, not even 3 months ago. Like, she's a hardcore, like, she seems soft-spoken and, like, she's, like, dainty. She's tough, okay? Don't mess with her. She had 3 kids completely naturally, no painkillers. She's tough, okay? Like, so don't mess with her, okay? But if you would you please welcome my wife Amy to the stage today? All right, I'm going to leave you to it. Is there anything else you want me to say?
Sounds good. No, I think you're good.
All right. But just for reference, if you're wondering, yes, I did marry someone taller than me. This is my answer to my genes being 5'6". I just figured if I married someone taller than me, and then my kids marry someone taller than them, 2 or 3 generations, we got 6-foot grapers. Chess, not checkers, right there, buddy. Chess, not checkers.
It was all a plan. Thank you guys for being here today. I'm really happy that you guys are here, and anybody watching online today, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm just so happy that you guys are here. So I have a question for you to start with. And you can go ahead and answer this out loud. It's not a trick question or anything, so go ahead, just say what comes to mind. If you're online, go ahead and write it in the chat, write a comment. 2020, wait, true or false? True or false? 2020 has been a disappointment. Okay. All right, we got 1 false, but I heard a lot of trues, okay? I don't know about you guys online. What do you think? Has 2020 been a disappointment? True or false? Well, I think some of you might be thinking, like, that's a huge understatement, right? That 2020's been a disappointment. Like, that's a nice way of putting it. Some of you might think, well, no, it wasn't really a disappointment to me. But I would say that if we're all honest, we would say that we've had disappointments in 2020. And not only that, but I would say that just saying that 2020 is a disappointment, that's just a true statement. Because what disappointment really is disappointment is just the gap between our expectations and reality. So when we went into 2020, we had expectations. And if you're like me, you had a planner or maybe your phone, and you had dates written down. You had events, you had birthdays, anniversaries, maybe vacations, and you had these plans. You had these expectations that you were going to be able to go places and celebrate holidays like normal and have birthday parties, and some of those things didn't happen. But even if you didn't have those kind of expectations, even if you just kind of roll with your year, you had expectations. You expected that you were going to be able to go to the movies. You expected that you were going to be able to go out to eat. If you had kids, you expected that they were going to be in school all year. You just expected these things were going to happen. And there's been a gap between what we expected and what reality brought in 2020. And that's when disappointment happens. That's when disappointment takes place. And so it's been a disappointing year for a lot of us. It's been a disappointing situation. And we've all had disappointing situations in our lives before. We've all had these situations where we expected something different than what actually happened. And I remember when Cameron and I were married, I think we were only married like a year at the time, and we were just newly married. I was a college student, and I was also working. We were really busy, but I decided that I wanted a puppy. And we had talked about this. I really wanted a puppy. And it wasn't the best timing because we had really busy lives. We lived in this tiny little apartment, but I wanted a puppy. I've never had a dog before, and just once we got married, I just wanted one. So This one day, we were at church this one morning, and we were meeting at the Knights of Columbus at the time. It was a Sunday morning, and we were just at church like normal, and Cameron's grandma came up to me, and she said, "How do you like your new baby?" And I was like, "What?" Like, my face must have shown a lot, because I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she's like, "Oh, I shouldn't have said anything." And she walked away. And so I'm like, he got me a puppy. Like, he's going to surprise me with a puppy. That's what she was talking about. And so the rest of this day, I'm just thinking, like, he got me a puppy. Like, where is he keeping this puppy? Like, when is he going to tell me about this puppy? And so that night, I'm thinking all these thoughts all day. We go out to dinner. We went to dinner out of town. And on our way back into town, he pulled off before he got to our apartment. He pulled off to the shop. And he said, "I want to show you something." And so I'm like, "Sure, I got a puppy." And I'm like, he's keeping it at the shop. That makes perfect sense. He had to keep it there. So I'm thinking, like, okay, this is the moment. Like, I'm so excited. So we go into the shop, and I was really confused because there was just this tiny black car sitting there. And he went on to explain that he had bought this Honda Del Sol, that he had got this really good deal on this Honda Del Sol, and he was going to fix it up, and he was going to sell it, and we were going to make some money, and he was really excited. And I was really disappointed because I was like expecting a puppy when I went in there. And I think that's how a lot of us went into 2020. I think that's what we've experienced. We went into 2020 and we were expecting a puppy, and we got this tiny black piece of crap car. When reality hit us in 2020, it was not what we expected. And I think that's when we can experience these disappointments. So it's November, if you're wondering. We're going into this week of Thanksgiving already, and we start to reflect back on the year. Once we get to the holidays, we kind of start to look back on what this past year has been, what things happened in it. And I know that I'm definitely starting to reflect. And when you think back on 2020, so much has happened. So many crazy things have happened this year. And it can be easy to forget all the crazy things that happened in 2020 because there's been so many crazy things. So let me just throw a couple things at you that you might have forgot that this even happened in 2020. So let me see if you forgot about a few of these things. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry quit the royal family. That happened at the beginning of the year. That was big news. Kobe Bryant tragically died. That happened this year, which was super surprising and shocked a lot of people. Tiger King, that happened in 2020. If you didn't remember, like when I heard that one, I was like, that was just 2020. Yes, I did watch it, unfortunately. That is actually the #1 documentary of all time. Because of the time it happened, we were all in quarantine. We all watched it. You guys are acting like you didn't watch it. I know you watched it. Gotta Google it after this. That'll be your takeaway, Tiger King. No, so that is the #1 documentary of all time because of what happened in 2020. The Olympics were canceled in 2020. That was a really sad thing for a lot of people. Murder hornets were a thing. If you didn't hear about that, Google that, murder hornets. That actually happened. George Floyd was killed. I don't think any of us forgot about that. And on top of all that crazy stuff, we're dealing with a pandemic. We're dealing with COVID-19, and it was an election year. So that was what 2020 was. Like, that is the face that I make about 2020. Like, that emoji with the eyes open, like, that's what 2020 is. A lot has happened in 2020. And so I'm starting to reflect on 2020, and I recently looked back on what I prayed for our church in 2020 before I knew anything of what the year was going to hold. And isn't it like weird? I don't know if you've thought about that yet. Like, what was life like before 2020? Like, what did I even complain about before 2020? It seems like such a more simple time. So before any of this craziness happened, I sat down and I prayed for our church in 2020. And it was really interesting what I prayed for to look back. But I just want to read you the first sentence, what I prayed for our church in 2020. And I wrote, I ask that you would give us a desperation for you, that we would be so hungry for the real thing, you, Jesus. Now, does anybody else feel desperate for Jesus in 2020, or am I the only one? I hope you guys do. And I think that if you're here, if you're watching online, you are an answer to my prayer. Because if you're here at church in the middle of a pandemic, or if you're watching online instead of scrolling, instead of looking at the news, I believe that you're an answer to my prayer, that you must be desperate for Jesus and to hear from him. So I believe that he's going to bless you for that. Would you just take a minute and pray with me right now? God, we just come to you, and we're just desperate before you today, God. We're desperate to hear what you might be speaking to us today. So would you help us just tune out all the noise, God? Would you help us to hear you and help me to speak this word that I believe is from you, and just open our hearts today to what you have to say to us. And I just pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. So with all of this in mind, I want to talk to you today about the topic of contentment. And I know you might hear that. I know Cameron mentioned it last week, and a couple people said to me, oh, we're talking about contentment. And I know you might be thinking, like, is that really, like, the right thing to be talking about right now, like contentment? Shouldn't Cameron just still be preaching on Revelation, like, every week? Keep going, like, it's the end of the world. Just keep talking about Revelation. Like, let's just figure out what to do. But I think it does. It perfectly applies to where we sit in 2020 today. Now, we're going to focus on a passage in the book of Philippians. So if you have your Bible, if you have your phone, you can turn to Philippians, because that's where we're going to be for this whole message. And before I read you the passage that I want to talk about today, I think it's important for us to understand who's writing this message and where he's writing it from. So the person who wrote Philippians was Paul. And if you remember, Paul was formerly Saul. Paul hated Christians. He murdered Christians, persecuted Christians, and Jesus radically saved him. And after he was saved, he began to preach, specifically to the Gentiles, and he preached the gospel everywhere. He also planted churches. And so this church is the church of Philippi. So this book, Philippians, it's just a letter from Paul to the people of Philippi, to this group of people that he knew and he loved. So Paul's just writing this letter, and that's what we're going off of today. And it's not just who wrote it that's important to know, it's where he wrote it from. So Paul tells us that when he wrote this book, he was in prison. He literally was chained to the ground as he wrote these words. And it's not just that he was in prison like for something he did and he found himself there. He was unjustly put in prison. He was put in prison just because people didn't like the message that he was talking about. So he was chained in order to kind of shut him up, to keep him quiet. So he's in this disappointing situation. He's in this prison cell physically. But it's not even just that he was physically in prison. Because Paul tells us that even though he was physically suffering, he was mentally and emotionally suffering as well. He says in chapter 1, verse 30, he says, "We are in this struggle together. You've seen my struggle in the past, and you know that I'm still in the midst of it." Another part in chapter 2, the next chapter, he talks about a mutual friend that they had. He talks about Epaphroditus, and he said, Epaphroditus, he got really sick, and he almost died, but he said that he believed God healed him so that he wouldn't have one sorrow on another, that it wouldn't add to his sorrow. And basically saying, like, God healed him because, like, he couldn't take it. If Epaphroditus would have died, it would have just crushed him. So we know that he's in this dark place emotionally and physically. He's suffering. I like the way this one theologian put it. I'm just going to read it to you about Paul's condition. He says, Paul's epistle to the Philippians is like a letter home from a soldier anticipating that he might die. Paul wrote Philippians at a time when he was suffering greatly, at a time when he wondered if he might soon be killed. And he wrote to people he loved. And so his words to the Christians in Philippi were heavy but caring. They were sad yet consoling. They were appreciative but bittersweet. And so with this context we have in mind, who was writing it, where he was writing it from, I want to read you the passage that I want us to focus on today. And it's Philippians 4:10 through 13. It says, "How I praise the Lord that you are concerned about me again. I know you have always been concerned for me, but you didn't have the chance to help me. Not that I was ever in need, for I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it's with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. And so Paul, he's talking to this church, this group of people that he loved, and he said, I know you were worried about me, and I know you're concerned about me and my condition, and you wanted to help me, and it didn't work out, and you tried to, but he said, you know what, it doesn't even matter, because I am content. And Paul makes this really interesting statement. He says, I have learned to be content in every situation. And he says, I can have everything, or I can have nothing. I can be hungry, or I can be full. I can be healthy, or I can be sick. Every situation, I can be content. I can be out preaching, I can be doing what God has called me to do, or I can be chained to a prison floor. I can be content in every situation, he says. And I wonder that today, are you content in every situation? I started off by saying 2020 is a disappointment. But did you know that we can be disappointed and content at the same time? I think a lot of us would think that those two things can't coexist, that you're either going to be disappointed or you're going to be content. But I think that they can. I think that we can be content and disappointed at the same time. Because you look at Paul, I'm sure Paul was disappointed. I'm sure that Paul's expectations were that he could be doing what God had called him to do. He could be out preaching. He could be with the churches that he'd planted, when reality was that he was stuck in a prison cell. And I'm sure that brought disappointment for Paul. But he had learned to be content in every situation. He might have been disappointed with his circumstances, but he was still content. So, what is contentment? What comes to your mind when you hear the word contentment? Well, contentment just means to be content. And I think a good synonym for contentment is satisfaction. I think that's a really good way of describing being content, is being satisfied with your life, being satisfied with what you have, being content. And I think a lot of us have a wrong view of what contentment is, because I think we associate contentment with being passive. Like, being content is just when you sit back and when you're just kind of like letting life roll by, like, well, it is what it is, like, I'm just content. But that's not what contentment is at all. I think that we associate contentment with weakness, but true contentment, it takes great strength. Now, we think about contentment, and I think if you would picture a person in your mind, like, who is a content person? I think that we would picture, like, Joanna Gaines, like just this housewife, just in her house, just content, and it's beautiful, and she's decorating, and she's happy. And I think that contentment is kind of like a feminine thing too, like we can think about. Like, I feel like I talk about contentment at like women's Bible studies. Like, that's where I've learned about contentment. But I think in reality, contentment is a lot more like Liam Neeson in Taken. Like, he's tough. He's strong, he's been through some stuff, he's acquired a certain set of skills over a long career, and he's been through stuff. He's tough, he's got strengths and skills. And I think, put that image in your mind, if anything, when you're thinking about contentment. Man, contentment is tough. It's not easy, it's not weak. To be content, you need skills and you need great strength. Contentment isn't a sign of weakness, it's actually a sign of strength. Now, verse 13 that I read, it's one of those verses that we see posted on Facebook, or you see it in a frame at a doctor's office or something, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. I'm sure you've heard that verse before. But did you ever hear the context of that verse, that he's actually talking about being content in the situation that he's found himself in, that he can do everything through Christ who gives me strength to be content? That's what he's talking about in that verse. He's saying that if you want to be content in every situation, it takes strength. It's not going to be easy. It doesn't come naturally to us. And what's interesting, I don't know if you've caught it, is Paul says that he's learned to be content. And he said that twice in that passage, that he's learned contentment. And he's implying that being content just isn't something you're born with. Like, some of us are content, some of us aren't content. It's just the way you're born, and that's how it is. No, he says that he's learned. like it's a skill. Like contentment is this skill that you can try, you can practice it, you can learn it. You have to learn from your mistakes. See, contentment isn't a disposition, contentment is a decision that we make. Contentment is a skill that we can try, we can practice it, we can learn it. And that's good news for us today, because if you feel like you aren't content, if you feel like you aren't satisfied in your life, Paul says you can learn it. It's a skill that you can develop. Now, Paul had been through a lot, and not just even the situation that he finds himself in now, but another part in the Bible, Paul lists all the difficulties that he's been through, that he'd been through shipwrecks, that he'd been beaten with rods, that he'd been betrayed by best friends. Paul had a tough life, and his ministry had not been easy. And in this passage, we find him sitting in a prison cell. And so in this book of Philippians, he gives us insight, I think, on how he's been able to learn this skill of contentment. Have you learned any new skills in 2020? I know for a lot of us women, we've learned skills like doing our hair ourselves. A few friends have tried to cut their hair themselves. They've tried to learn the skill of coloring our hair ourselves. And guys, maybe you've tried to learn some skills as you're doing these home improvement projects we've all been doing. Maybe you've been on YouTube trying to learn some new skills or Googling stuff. We've been trying to learn these new skills, but what if in 2020 we could learn the skill of contentment? How would that change this year, and how would it change every year going forward? See, the enemy wants us to get stuck in a place of discontentment. He wants us to get stuck dwelling on our disappointments and living in this perpetual state of discontentment. Now, Paul says, I've learned to be content in every situation. Now, the enemy would have us be discontent in every situation. And the enemy, what he does is he gets us to believe the lie that I'll be content when. And he says, I'll be content when I can get out of my parents' house. When I get out of high school, then I'll be content. Or I'll be content when I get married. Or, when I make $100,000 a year, then I'll be content. Or $200,000 a year, then I'll be content. When 2020 is over, I'll be content. I just want to get through this year and I'll be fine. Or when we get a different president, I'll be content. But all of that is a lie, because our circumstances don't produce contentment. More stuff, more money, it doesn't produce contentment. Now, Paul didn't say, I'll be content when I get out of prison, when I can do what God's calling me to do, then I'll be content. Or he didn't say, when someone actually hears my case and gives me justice, I'll be content. No. He said, I'll be content in every situation. Right here, right now, right where I'm at, I can be content. Hurting, disappointed, I'll be content. See, contentment is not a result of our circumstances. It's a state of our heart. It's a decision that we make to be satisfied and to be content. So how do we learn this skill of contentment? And I think Paul gives us a few quick things that are really important if we want to learn this skill of contentment. And one of the things that we can practice contentment is by getting the right perspective. Now, Paul says in Philippians 1, 12 through 14, he says, and I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. For everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I'm in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. Paul had perspective for what God was doing in his life. Paul said, I may be in prison, but God has me here for a reason. God's using me here right where I'm at. He says, because of my imprisonment, God was using him. He could have dwelled on those disappointments, but he didn't. He didn't dwell on his disappointments. He looked past his current difficulties, and he could see the big picture, how God was using him right where he was at. He had perspective. So how is God using you in 2020? Have you been able to see the big picture at all, or have you just been so busy dwelling on those little disappointments? Paul could have sat and he could have dwelled on his disappointments. I'm sure that he was hungry. I'm sure he was cold. I'm sure he was uncomfortable. And he couldn't even do what God called him to do. He could have used it as an excuse to abandon his calling. He could have said, I can't even preach. I'm chained here, so God must not want me to be preaching because I can't do it. He could have used his circumstances as an excuse and as an excuse to abandon God's calling, but he didn't. He said, I might not be able to preach out there. I might not be able to be with the churches, but I can preach in here. There's people in here. There's prison guards. There's prisoners. I can preach to them. And not only that, obviously, God used him to write the Bible during this time. God was working in a massive way in Paul's life in this time, but he could have missed it if he just dwelled on those little disappointments. And I think a lot of us are dwelling on the disappointments of 2020. You know, we're dwelling on the fact that life is not what we expected, that we want to do certain things and we can't. And maybe you're dwelling on the fact that your kids are home and they can't go to school, and it's disappointing. And maybe you're dwelling on the fact that you have to be home all the time and you have to cook instead of go out to eat. Or maybe you're dwelling on the fact that we have to go on Zoom all the time and Zoom sucks and we hate in spite of what's happening in 2020. He can use this because of what's happening in 2020. That God has us here for a reason, that he's using us right where we're at. Difficult circumstances are opportunities to practice contentment. And I think that's critical for us to get because we're in difficult circumstances right now. And things might not go back to normal. And that's what everybody keeps saying, oh, when things go back to normal. But things might not. Things might never go back to normal. Perspective can. You can go into 2021 with a different perspective. Perspective is something that produces contentment. Knowing that God is doing something in me for a reason in this season that I'm in. Now, another way that we can practice contentment, this skill that we can learn, we can develop it, another way is through our praise. Now, in the book of Philippians, and it's a small book, it's only 4 chapters, Paul uses the words joy and rejoice 16 times. And I think that's surprising because I think we would expect with what I've told you about Philippians that maybe like he would use the word suffering 16 times or something. But it's notable in Philippians that he uses these words joy and rejoice over and over again. Now, rejoice is kind of like an old school word. I don't think many of us use it very often, to rejoice. But what rejoice simply means is to feel or show great joy. And I think Paul says it the most clearly in chapter 4, verse 4. He says, always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Now, Paul doesn't leave much up to interpretation as far as when we should rejoice. He says, always. So that means in 2020, we should rejoice. And again, I think it's so important to remember like who is writing this, where it's coming from. This isn't just somebody living life, living their best life, happy, and he's just saying, just cheer up, just be happy, it could be worse. That's not the situation at all. Paul was in very dark circumstances at the time. He was in a very dark place. I'm sure he was struggling with all the kinds of things we're struggling with right now. But he says, always be full of joy in the Lord. Rejoice. And he says it over and over again. And I know things are hard right now, and they're hard for different people and for different reasons. But all of us have something that we can rejoice about. Paul took the most painful situation in the darkest place, and he could still rejoice. So if Paul could rejoice in a prison, we can rejoice in a pandemic. We have to find something to rejoice about. I know that your situation might be bad right now, and you might have gone through a lot this year. You might have experienced loss. Maybe you have lost a loved one, or you lost a job. Or maybe you're dealing with addiction or depression, anxiety, or maybe just loneliness. I think a lot of us are experiencing right now. Things are hard for us. But can you find something to rejoice about today? I know in my life, a lot of times I can find a reason to rejoice when I remember. Like I said in the beginning, there's been so much crazy stuff that's happened this year that we can forget, like, oh my gosh, I forgot Kobe Bryant died this year. Like, I forgot that even happened this year. And that can happen with the good things too. We can just get so busy with our year and so busy dwelling on the disappointments that we forgot about all the good things that God did for us in 2020, all the ways that he showed his faithfulness to us in 2020. It's really easy to talk about how much 2020 was hard, how much we hated it, and how many things, happened in it. But you just have to look around for the good things. You have to look back and look for those good moments to see the ways that God was with us. And Christians, we could stand out so much if we put this into practice, because as you'll see, as the year comes to an end, as we get closer to the new year approaching, you're going to see people saying and posting things like, good riddance 2020, 2020 was just garbage, like move on with the new year, and we're going to use 2020 as a curse word, that's how bad it was. But what if we were different? And what if we had a different perspective and we said, you know what, 2020 was hard, but I grew in my faith like never before. Or 2020, it wasn't easy, but through it, I learned that God was with me wherever I'm at. I learned that I don't have to be in a church building for God to speak to me. I can be watching church online. I can be in my house listening to a song, and God just can speak to me wherever I'm at. God's always with me. Or what if you said, 2020 had difficult circumstances, but through it, I had an opportunity to practice contentment. I got to realize that no matter what happens, no matter how difficult things get, that God is enough, and he is enough for me. Don't rush so fast into 2021 that you forget what God's doing in 2020, what he's doing in your life, how he's using you, what he's done for you this past year. I want to read you that passage one more time, Philippians 4:11 through 13. And it says, "For I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it's with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength." Now, did you catch the fact that Paul says he's learned the secret? The secret is Christ. It's having Jesus. He is the secret to experiencing true satisfaction and contentment. In Psalm 107, 8 and 9, it says, "Let them praise the Lord for his great love and for the wonderful things he has done for them. For he satisfies the thirsty, and he fills the hungry with good things." Through Christ, we can experience true contentment and true satisfaction. When we realize that he is enough, he satisfies our soul. No matter what the circumstances are, he is enough for us. Now, we're going to keep moving forward, and we're going to go into 2021, and I hope that our circumstances change. But what if they don't? What if nothing changes? Are you going to let your circumstances define your contentment? Are you going to just stay dwelling on those disappointments? Or are you going to learn contentment? Use your difficult circumstances to practice it. Get perspective for how God is using you. Find something that you can rejoice about. And if you have nothing you can rejoice about, you know what you can rejoice about? God's faithfulness. The fact that he's the same. He never changes. You can rejoice about the fact that he's promised that he's always going to be with us. No matter what we go through, God is always going to be with us. He's never going to leave us. He's been through us through every part of this year, and he's not going to leave us no matter how hard things get. We all have something to rejoice about. He's with you. He is the secret, and he is enough for us. Through him, we can be content in every situation. And I want to leave you with this verse. In chapter 3, verse 1, Paul says, "Whatever happens, my dear brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord." And I think that's pretty appropriate for us today. Whatever happens this week, this month, this year, rejoice in the Lord. Whatever happens in your job, whatever happens in our country, rejoice in the Lord. And I just want to take a moment while we're here. And before we walk out of here and before we forget, I just want to take a moment to just put this into practice. So would you just bow your heads with me? Before we walk out of here, I just want to take a moment to reflect. What do you have to rejoice about today? Wherever you sit this morning, if you're here, or maybe if you're watching online, if you're on your couch right now, what do you have to rejoice about today? Do you have a family? If you have health? If you have your job, can you just rejoice about that, even in your mind? Can you thank God for all the good things that He's given you, all the way He's blessed you? Can you just take a moment right now to thank Him for all those good things? He's given us so much. Every day, His faithfulness is there. His mercies are new every morning. We have so much to rejoice about, who God is, what He's done for us. And would you just take a moment, just reflect on this past year? Can you get perspective? Can you see the ways that He's been using you, the ways that He's been working in your life? Have you had moments where even though things have been hard and things have been difficult, that you've felt His presence with you, that you've known that He's with you even through those difficult circumstances? Just reflect on what God's done for you this past year, how He's been with you, how He's been using you. Even through the difficult circumstances. Every difficult time you experienced this past year, He was with you. Every struggle, every disappointment, He was always with you. God, we just thank You that You've never left us. Through all the things that this year has brought, You've been with us every step of the way. And we just acknowledge that You are enough for us, God. That no matter how hard things get, You are enough. And we thank You that You're doing things in this place. You're doing things in us, God. We rejoice all the things that You've given us, all the ways that You've shown Your faithfulness to us this past year, God. Would You give us the strength to practice contentment in our difficult circumstances right now? I pray that if there's somebody who can't get perspective, they can't see what You're doing in their life, God, help them to see the ways that You've been using them, that they might have been in a prison, but that You can still use them. You have them here for a reason. You can use them because of the situation that they're in, God. Help us to get that perspective this morning. And if there's anybody here today, or maybe you're watching online, and you can't grasp that concept of being content and being satisfied, and it seems out of reach to you, and it's because you don't have a relationship with Jesus. Paul said that's the secret, is having Jesus. That's the secret to true contentment. And if you don't have that, you can experience that today. You can invite Jesus into your life today. And you could just simply echo this prayer in your heart. Jesus, I'm sorry for my sin. Thank You for dying in my place. Please become the Lord of my life. And you can say that in your heart. And I believe Jesus is going to rush in. And He is going to satisfy you. He is going to bring true contentment into your life. And God, we thank You for everything that You're doing in us, God. We just acknowledge that You are enough for us, God. Help us to be content. Help us to walk out the rest of this year and the coming year differently than the world would. That we would have perspective, that we would have true joy in our hearts as we walk forward into this next year. And I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.